Chapter 26. The Brahman, the Holy Man. With diligent effort, stop the stream of existence. Destroy all desires, O Brahman. Realize the decay of all things created, and become the realizer of the uncreated, Nirvana. When the Brahman has taken the two paths, meditation and awareness, to beyond this world, then he has realized the truth, and all his shackles fall away. He for whom there is neither this shore nor the other shore, for whom neither shore exists, and who is fearless and free of all shackles, him I call a true Brahman. He who is meditative, free of blemishes, and calm, who has finished all his tasks and attained the highest goal, him I call a true Brahman. The sun shines during the day, the moon shines during the night, the warrior shines when he wears his armor, and the Brahman shines when he is in meditation. But Buddha shines in splendor day and night. He who has rid himself of evil is called a Brahman. He who walks in serenity is called a Samana, monk. He who has renounced all impurities is called Pavagita, a pilgrim. No one should attack a Brahman, and no Brahman should respond with anger at his attacker. Woe to him who strikes a Brahman, yet more woe to him who reciprocates in anger. A Brahman gains much if he restrains his mind from the pleasures of life. When all desire to harm has vanished, suffering too cease. He who commits no harm by body, speech, or thought, and is restrained on these 3 points, him I call a true Brahman. He who has learned the sacred truth from his teacher should honor his teacher, just as the Brahman honors the sacrificial fire. Neither by his plaited hair, nor by his family or by birth does a man become a Brahman. He who has realized the truth and embraced the sacred law, such a man is pure. He is a Brahman. What is the use of your plaited hair, O fool? What is the use of your cloak made of animal skins? While within you dwell sins, you keep your exterior clean. He who wears discarded rags is emaciated, with veins visible over his entire body, who lives alone in the forest and meditates. Him I call a true Brahman. I do not call a man a Brahman just because he was born from a mother of high status. If he is attached to his possessions, he is indeed arrogant. But he who possesses nothing and is detached, him I call a true Brahman. He who has cut all his shackles, who is now fearless, and who is no longer bound to this world and is free, him I call a true Brahman. He who has cut the strap of hatred, and the thong of desire, and the rope and bridle too of false beliefs, who has lifted the bar of ignorance, and is now awakened, him I call a true Brahman. He who suffers abuse, assault, and punishment without showing any anger, whose power and army is his patience, him I call a true Brahman. He who is free from anger, dutiful, virtuous, without desires, who is restrained and has received his last body, him I call a true Brahman. He who does not cling to earthly pleasures, just as water clings not to a lotus leaf, and like a mustard seed clings not to the point of a needle, him I call a true Brahman. He who in this very life has realized the end of his suffering, who has put down his burden, and free from all shackles, him I call a true Brahman. He whose knowledge runs deep, who is wise, who recognizes which path is right and which is wrong, and who has attained the highest goal, him I call a true Brahman. He who keeps aloof, both from the ordinary man and the ascetic, who dwells in no abode, and who has no desires, him I call a true Brahman. He who inflicts no injury any being, whether feeble or strong, and who does not kill nor cause slaughter, him I call a true Brahman. He who is amiable among the antagonistic, who is calm among the violent, and is detached among the attached, him I call a true Brahman. He from whom lust, hatred, pride, and envy have dropped away like a mustard seed drops away from the point of a needle, him I call a true Brahman. He whose speech is true, enlightening and free from harshness, who offends no one with his words, him I call a true Brahman. He who takes nothing in the world that is not given him, whether it is long or short, small or large, good or bad, him I call a true Brahman. He seeks nothing from this world or the next, who has no desires, and who is free from all shackles, him I call a true Brahman. He who has no attachments, who has freed himself of all doubts through perfect wisdom, and who has entered into the depth of the deathless, and who has entered into the depth of the deathless, him I call a true Brahman. He who in this world has risen above the bonds of good and evil, who is free from grief and sins, and is pure, him I call a true Brahman. He who is spotless, pure, serene and clear like the moon, and who delights in forsaking existence, him I call a true Brahman. He who has traversed this miry road, the impassable world and its vanity, who has wandered through and reached the other shore, who is mindful, meditative, free from doubts and attachments, and is content, him I call a true Brahman. He who has renounced all desires, who has renounced all attachments and become homeless, and in whom all concupiscence is extinct, him I call a true Brahman. He who has renounced all desires, who has renounced all attachments and become homeless, and in whom all covetousness is extinct, him I call a true Brahman. He who is free from the bonds of mankind, who is even free from bondage to the gods, and who is free from all and every bondage, him I call a true Brahman. He who has discarded both pleasures and displeasures alike, who is calm and detached, and who, like a hero, has conquered all the worlds, him I call a true Brahman. He who knows the destruction and the rebirth of beings everywhere, who is free from bondage, exalted and awakened, him I call a true Brahman. He whose path cannot be traced by neither humans nor spirits or gods, who is free of impurities, and who is an arahant, venerable, him I call a true Brahman. He who is free of the past, present, and future, who has no attachments, and who calls nothing his own, him I call a true Brahman. He who is noble, supreme, the hero, the great sage, the conqueror, who is free of all sins, pure, awakened, him I call a true Brahman. He who knows his former lives, who sees heaven and hell, who has reached the end of births, who possesses great knowledge, who is a sage, and who has attained spiritual perfection, him I call a true Brahman.